Welcome back to Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max and I'm here with Tony as usual. And today we have a very exciting guest, Robert Davidson. He's an author and battlefield guide from South Africa. And we're going to talk to him about that and his book today. So welcome to the show, Robert. How are you?
Thanks very much. I'm very well. I'm speaking to you from Cape Town at present. As background, I'm a doctor who's retired, but my sort of hobby and my pastime has always been history, South African military history. And since I was a kid, really, I was fascinated by the battlefields in Natal, where I grew up. Spent all my sort of school holidays camping out on the battlefields with the homemade metal detector, collecting things that I could find. And so I've really been interested in the battles along the Tugela River, the battles to relieve Ladysmith for almost all my life, so well over 50 years. And then when I retired, I began to sort of take a more active research interest in this. And then for the last 15 years or so, I've been trying to put together the evidence needed to put together a book on the Spioenkop campaign, not just the Battle of Spioenkop itself, which was very brief and very tragic, but the bigger 10-day campaign which surrounded Spioenkop, which was a far bigger military action than the Spioenkop battle itself, but which has been completely kind of overlooked, I think, given the notoriety of the Spioenkop tragedy. So that's my background. I visit the battlefields still on a regular basis. I was there last week. I don't take guests as a sort of commercial activity, but I'm always happy to share experiences with people.
Wow, that is a very amazing background, Rob. Did you ever find anything with your metal detector when you was a kid?
But these battlefields are full of debris. You know, a lot of stuff was recycled after the war for scrap metal value. You know, they fired millions and millions of rounds of ammunition, rifle ammunition. So there's always stuff turning up on the surface of battlefields. I don't remove anything these days, not since my childhood, because the only relevance of the scrap metal is its exact location and what it is. It tells you what happened on that spot. So, for example, what you find in walking the battlefields is mainly the low remnants of trenches and stone walls. That would normally be what you find. And what's in the ground will tell you what the wall was used for. For example, a typical finding on the Spioenkop battlefields might be a low wall behind which you find the ignition T-friction tubes from a British artillery position. So you know that the wall was built to defend artillery. Then you might find in front of it some expended Boer bullets to show it was under rifle fire. You might find some expended Boer shrapnel as well to show it was under Boer artillery fire. So, you know, what looks like an anonymous sort of stone wall in the middle of the bush, with the GPS, you can say exactly that this is where a field gun was.
Exactly. And you can kind of map it out and put it on a map and get a pretty good view of what happened.
Yes, the GPS was accurate to less than a meter. And as long as everything stays in the ground, it's not going to be lost for the future generations. And of course, none of this battlefield debris has any commercial value. Its only value is from its position.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I mean, we have a lot of that in Europe as well, but I think it's quite emotional to go and look at battlefields and to also when you find artifacts, but it gives a lot of value, definitely. Could you tell us a bit about the background to the Anglo-Boer War?
Yes. So the years of the war was from October 1899 till the end of May 1902, a very long, drawn-out, almost 3-year war. And it was fought between the British Empire and the two Boer republics, which were the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Prior to 1899, South Africa had been a fairly sleepy and kind of neglected place. What was curious about it was that there were two independent Dutch-speaking countries within it, and then two British colonies, the colony of the Cape and the colony of Natal. Things changed from the late 1880s when gold was discovered in the Transvaal, and that then immediately transformed in character to being a very valuable asset for the British Empire. So the reason the war was inevitable was partly because the gold was really a great attraction to Britain, and also because there'd been a previous war between the Transvaal and Britain in 1881, which the British had lost. That was from the Battle of Majuba. Now, during the British Empire, Britain lost very few wars. It lost the American War of Independence, and it lost the Transvaal War of Independence, but almost everything else Britain won. So Britain was really very set on revenge for the defeat at Majuba and very keen to acquire the goldfields of the Transvaal. New Year's Day 1896 was the infamous Jameson raid, which kind of set the clock ticking. And from that time onwards, the Boer Republic spent a third of their revenue on rearming for the inevitable war. And the war broke out in October 1899. The Boers invaded the Cape and Natal to try and get early advantage before reinforcements came. And that led to the three main sieges that you've heard of: Kimberley, Mafeking, and Ladysmith, the sieges, of which the siege of Ladysmith is the one we're talking about today. From the 2nd of November, the town was besieged with about 27,000 people in the town, half of whom were soldiers, half of whom were civilians. And the town was surrounded by Boer positions, and the town was bombarded on a regular basis by Boer artillery. And the other thing that was happening was that typhoid was beginning to break out in the town of Ladysmith, eventually becoming a massive problem to the besieged citizens. But it was a huge political embarrassment to Britain. The army in Natal was besieged, and that the whole of the British Empire was paying close attention on a daily basis to the fate of Ladysmith. And the battles we are talking about, the battles of the Spioenkop campaign, were an attempt by the British to break through into Ladysmith and relieve the siege. So that's the sort of background to the event.
Thanks for that, Rob. And I'm also from Cape Town, just as a fun fact, from Observatory, and now currently living in Edinburgh, but I do miss home. But going back to the campaign,
Yes.
And specifically the Spioenkop battle and the battle surrounding that, could you give us some of the main protagonists in the Battle of Spioenkop, and also what became of them?
Sure. Well, what's quite sort of notable about the campaign was that it seems to be the first time that the sympathy and the interest of the common man seemed to prevail to a very high degree with the British public. So we can talk about the common man's experience because so much was written of eyewitnesses from the campaign. This was brought to the public's attention by the presence of these photographs of the dead on Spioenkop. And these were published throughout the British Empire, and it immediately caused an outpouring of interest and curiosity throughout the empire as to what horrors these men had suffered before they were killed. The public had never seen any photographs like this before. Recognizable faces and British dead lying in large numbers in trenches or out in the open. In a way, it's the experience of the little guy, the ordinary soldier or the ordinary burgher, which became very prominent at the time of Spioenkop. And it seemed to coincide with an increase in literacy and the ability to send letters home. And of course, there was very little censorship at this time in the press. So photographs and accounts of the battle, no matter how horrific, were published with incredible enthusiasm by newspapers and magazines. When we talk about what happened to the protagonists, the ordinary soldiers look back on Spioenkop with incredible pride. They often claim to have been there when they were not there, particularly on the Boer side. Almost any Boer who was in Natal said he was at Spioenkop. And in fact, there were only 300 Boers on the Besant of Spioenkop on the day. So there was a lot of that sort of outcome of people perhaps exaggerating their role, not for sympathy, but because of perhaps wanting to identify with the suffering which had happened. The other thing that happened is that there was a lot of soldiers seemed to have shell shock. They called it general nervous shock. And this was really the first time that the doctors, both in Cape Town and in Britain, saw large numbers of soldiers who'd been unable to recover. They'd either not been wounded or they'd been wounded slightly, but they had their health continue to deteriorate. Physical manifestations are psychological stress. Things we would now call shell shock or PTSD were first described after Spioenkop. The generals who were involved were immediately engaged in a sort of blaming contest, which I really don't want to get drawn into at all, because I can see with great clarity the problems that the generals face, and I can't see a scapegoat anywhere in the story who can be blamed. There are three main sort of international celebrities who are linked to Spioenkop. The first is the Boer general Louis Botha, who became the first prime minister of South Africa when it became an independent country. And he was the commander of the Boer forces at Spioenkop. And there's no question he was absolutely brilliant leader. And he is very closely associated with the battle, quite rightly. The next is Winston Churchill, who was a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse. You'll recall that he had previously been a correspondent and then had been captured on the 15th of November at the armored train disaster. He'd then gone to Pretoria as a prisoner. He'd escaped. He'd made his way to the Mozambique port of Lorenzo Marx, come all the way back down to Durban on a ship, and then on a train back up to the front line again, so that by Boxing Day, just 6 weeks after his capture, he re-enlisted in the South African Light Horse with the permission to continue to file newspaper reports while he was a soldier. But he described the battles prior to Spioenkop very well, and he was on Spioenkop. In fact, he climbed Spioenkop twice during the battle. It should be said he didn't venture far onto the summit because the firing was so intense. He thought it would be really foolish. So Winston Churchill's the second celebrity who's associated with it. And the final one is Mohandas Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian independence leader. He had been a solicitor in Durban prior to the Boer War. And when the war broke out, he got together the Natal Volunteer Indian Ambulance Corps, and 1,000 Indian civilians living in Natal who acted in a non-combatant role in carrying the wounded, British wounded. He kind of exaggerated his role. He said he was in the firing line at Spioenkop, but in fact they were a fair way away. I think his men behaved incredibly well and compassionately towards the wounded, but they weren't exposed to fire, despite him sort of hinting that it had been thus. So that's what happened to the little guy, and that's what happened to the generals. And the main two generals who got into the slanging match were General Buller, the commander-in-chief, and General Charles Warren, who was his second in command, as to who had been responsible. As I say in my book, really these things were inevitably decided by the facts on the ground. I don't think there was a great deal of mismanagement at high level at all, from what I can see.
Actually like it, Robert, when we are getting into my favorite general, Louis Botha, since we have done plenty of episodes on him, and of course Tony has written a book on him, and I can only agree with you, and I think there was not a lot of mismanagement on the ground. There were quite difficult decisions, and they made the best they could. So I am going to go in a bit more into your book now, a bit deeper. Could you give us an overview of what happened at Acton Homes and on what you termed in your book as the failed march west?
Sure, pleasure. So the action takes place on the Upper Tugela, that's west of the railway line. They're trying to circle around towards Ladysmith by going west, crossing the Tugela River northwards, and then heading east to Ladysmith, a big encircling movement. And the problem being that they were much too slow to be able to do this with any great success. So they were really moving to better positions in order to do frontal attacks. The Boers were much, much quicker than the British were in all of their movements. So we're now sort of 25 kilometers upstream of the railway line. The British have crossed at 2 pontoon bridges, one at Potgietersdrift, a third of the army has gone across. It's 8 battalions, and then 16 battalions have crossed higher up at Trichardsdrift. So a total of about 20,000 soldiers, about 2,500 cavalry, 7 batteries of field artillery, howitzers, mountain guns, etc. So a big relieving force, the Natal Field Force. On the 17th of January, the crossing of Trichardstrift was in progress, and the Mounted Brigade under Lord Colonel Dundonald waded their horses across and began to move westwards to try and probe to the western side of the Boer lines. The Boers they knew were on the hills in front of them. They couldn't see them. They didn't know how many they were or what their dispositions were. And their maps were absolutely non-existent or hopeless. By the 18th of January, the army was still crossing the pontoons, and Dundonald had taken the mounted men more or less out of sight to the left of the British position, which is to the west of the British position. And while on patrol there, Lieutenant Duncan Mackenzie of the Natal Carbineers spotted a large commando of Boers moving down the road from Ladysmith towards the Orange Free State. And he asked permission from Major Graham of the Lancers to intercept them. And with a very small force, 40 Natal Carbineers and 40 Imperial Light Horse, these are all colonial mounted men, he galloped off unseen to behind two low hills, low koppies, which were on either side of the Orange Free State Road. The Boers were completely taken by surprise. There were about 320 Boers, and as I said, about 80 colonials. When they were almost at point-blank range, the colonials opened fire, and quite quickly they managed to kill 10 Boers. There were 8 wounded, and they captured about 24 prisoners of war. So it was a small ambush, which was a great morale boost because there had been nothing but tragedies and losses from the British perspective prior to this. And thus far in Natal, their big problem was they could never see the enemy. They couldn't see them alive or dead. They were so at such long range, and they were so well concealed that it was a huge morale boost. The problem was also exaggerated by the fact that Dundonald was a kind of self-promoting or over-publicized officer, and he kind of exaggerated the significance of what he'd achieved, which is to take up a position on the Ladysmith Orange Free State Road. And this has partly been because nobody knew where this action had taken place. Using the local knowledge of people who've lived there all their lives and the use of a metal detector, it's no question that one can locate this action to about 7 kilometers further away from Ladysmith than was illustrated in the maps. So if you look at the Times history map, it's in entirely the wrong place. There are maps in which it's in the correct place, mind you. But the general impression has been that Dundonald scored a massive tactical success, and that General Warren, by failing to move towards Dundonald and follow up on this, had led to the disaster of Spioenkop. That was the kind of notion. As well as the battle being in entirely a different place to what people had thought, the other thing is there was a massive westward march starting in the early hours of the 19th. It was an attempt by Warren with 6 battalions of men to move west to join up with Dundonald. And the fact is there was no decent road, and with the rainy season, the track got churned up by the wheels and the horses' hooves. And by the end of 12 hours of marching, they'd only gone about 3 miles. And it became clear they couldn't effectively reach Dundonald's position, no matter what they did. Not that it would have helped, mind you, because it was really a long way from Ladysmith. And so on the 19th of January, the army was spent with this futile attempt to march west. And then in the late afternoon, they turned around and went back to their starting positions. And it became clear that they would have to attack the high ground directly in front of them, which is the plateau called Tabanyama. Tabanyama in isiZulu means Black Mountain, but it's just a large, irregular plateau. The strength of it is not that it's particularly high. I mean, you can climb up it fairly easily in several points. But the problem is when you get to what you see on the skyline, that's not the high ground. The high ground is about 1 to 2 kilometers further. And between the first crest, which you can see from the valley, and the true crest, which is the high ground where the Boers were entrenching, was an absolutely featureless grass plateau. And the infantry would have to cross this ground towards the trenches if they wanted to finally break through. So what was extraordinary on Tabanyama was that these highly mobile Boers, quite out of character, were digging deep entrenchments where they would stay for 10 days without any mobility whatsoever, and they were completely kind of ahead of their time. This was a kind of premonition of what the Great War would be like. The difference is that in the Great War, the trench lines were separated by perhaps 100 or 200 meters, and on Tabanyama, they were separated by 1,500 meters on average. But the Boer Mauser and the 303 Lee Enfield are both can be used at those long ranges. They've got sights up to 2,000 meters. And so it was a very, very long-range war. It was probably unique, I think, in the history of warfare, for having been conducted with the lines so widely far apart and with such an exposed plateau between the two lines that attempts by the British to charge forward were really quite futile. So that's what happened with the failed march west, was the realization that they couldn't outflank the Boers whatever they did, and they would have to do a series of frontal assaults, which took place on the 20th, 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of January. This was the fighting on Tabanyama, the Battle of Tabanyama itself. And it was the inability for the Battle of Tabanyama to make progress, which meant that the British tried a flank attack onto Spioenkop, which overlooks Tabanyama. And then Spioenkop became a tragedy which sucked in all the resources that the British Army could provide.
That's fascinating the way you explained it about the digging of trenches on Tabanyama. Before we move on to the Battle of Spioenkop proper, could you maybe give us a bit more about how that battle took place, the Battle of Tabanyama?
Well, the first thing to say is, in the absence of maps and in the absence of local guides who knew the terrain, things really had to be worked out by the people on the ground. There'd been very limited reconnaissance, and the reconnaissance had mainly been on the east of Tabanyama, which is an area called Spur 1 or 3 Tree Hill. So the first high ground that the British were going to take on the morning of the 20th, just before dawn, was going to be 3 Tree Hill. It's a low hill, which at that time there was mainly grass everywhere. There were very, very few trees. And on 3 Tree Hill, as the name would suggest, there were 3 spreading acacia trees. The British cut them down actually within 24 hours and made an aiming mark for the Boer guns. But 3 Tree Hill was taken without opposition by General Woodgate's men, the South Lancashires. And it was taken just before dawn on the 20th. And the reason there was no opposition was that the Boers had already moved back into their trench line, which is about 1,500 meters higher up on the true summit. So that was then the first prominent position the British had occupied on Tabanyama. And then they moved from the east to the west, taking then Spur 2, which was much more difficult. It was known that would be difficult. So General Hart's brigade had been given 2 extra battalions to take this. It was going to be difficult for several reasons. The first is that, unlike 3 Tree Hill, it hadn't been reconnaissanced. You couldn't tell anything about it from the valley below. You couldn't tell what you would find once you got onto the plateau. And the front line would be out of sight from the valley, so that you couldn't bring covering fire or artillery fire to protect the advance. So it was a very drawn out and with a lot of heavy losses from General Hart. He was a man who took pride in casualties among his men. He thought it was a sign of great courage that he lost men. And he led from the front with his sword waving. But nonetheless, it took them hours to get forward up the spur. And in the end, the intensity of Boer fire from their trenches forced the firing line, that was the Lancashire Fusiliers and the York and Lancasters, to actually be pinned down. So the second line, which was the Border Regiment and the Dublin Fusiliers, kind of marched through them and kept going. They found themselves under intense fire as well, and then naturally sagged into a valley on the right where they were pinned down and actually spent the night way ahead of the rest of the British lines. So that was Spur 1 and Spur 2. Spur 3 and 4 were not defended by the Boers and were taken towards the afternoon as afternoon drew on. And then Spur 5, which is Bastion Hill, was taken as an independent action by the South African Light Horse. So this is another one that Winston Churchill participated in and describes very accurately and in great detail in his books. So the South African Light Horse took Bastion Hill, which is a sort of extension from the south from Tabanyama. Again, it was unopposed because the Boers occupied an area of high ground called Platkop, Flat Hill, which is just about a kilometer further and could really overlook Bastion Hill. So by the late afternoon of the 20th, the whole of the southern crest, which is kind of a zigzag of about 8 kilometers of hillside, was in British hands and was being fortified by the British. And then by the same evening, about 1.5 kilometers across the plateau, the Boers were perfecting their trenches and they continued to dig during the night. And during the night, both sides fired star shells. These are magnesium shells, which will momentarily light up the battlefield. And it was to try and prevent the risk of a night attack. Both sides were very worried that the other side would take the advantage in the night and would attack them. So that's what happened in Tabanyama on the 20th. It was quite a costly series of battles, but in the end, the British Army held the southern crest, and for the next 4 days, they were stuck in exactly that position, unable to move forward. On the 21st of January, the following day, there was an attack by Colonel Walter Kitchener. He commanded the West Yorkshire battalion of the West Yorks. But because he was well connected, Walter Kitchener was Lord Kitchener's brother. He kind of took on the command of 3 battalions, the East Surreys, the West Surreys, and the West Yorks, and tried a futile frontal attack against the high ground of Plotkop. And by noon of that day, he'd lost 100 men, and his superior officer, General Clary, called the attack off. Colonel Kitchener never seemed to get any criticism for that. I think he was just untouchable because of his family connections. But it was a disastrous lesson to learn about attempting to charge trenches across open ground. So that was on the 21st of January. The days of the 22nd and the 23rd were spent in long-range firing from both the Boer position and the British position, and the attempt by the Royal Field Artillery to shell the Boers out of their trenches. But these trenches were very deep and narrow and provided perfect cover against shrapnel. The British brought up howitzers to fire lyddite, high explosives, 50-pound shells. But unless you were hit by a direct hit from a lyddite shell, the kind of neighborhood of the explosion was pretty safe. So as the Boers became accustomed to being shelled, they got less and less kind of worried about the effect of shelling. And it was clear to both sides that the ground would have to be taken by infantry, that artillery could only do so much, but couldn't get the Boers out of their trenches. Again, very much a premonition of what happens in the Great War, when massive artillery bombardments failed to get either side to vacate the trench.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about the dynamic, how they use the terrain from both sides and also the trenches. And let's get into the Battle of Spioenkop. Could you walk us through how that unfolded and what happened there?
Just to go back to the entrenching, Louis Botha some years later said that his secret weapon was the spade. So he kind of discovered the idea that if you dig trenches deep enough and secure enough, you really were impregnable. The Boer line was entrenched on either side of Spioenkop. So Tabanyama had this series of about 8 kilometers of Boer trenches, and then on the eastern side of Spioenkop, along Twin Peaks in the Brockfontein position, was a similar line of deep trenches. But Spioenkop itself wasn't entrenched. The British had noticed this. They'd been watching Spioenkop, which is such a high, prominent hilltop, and they could see a handful of Boers up there looking around, but they knew there were no trenches there. What they didn't realize is the reason there are no trenches there, that it's impossible to dig trenches on Spioenkop, because Spioenkop is a flat-topped mountain, and it's flat-topped because it's reached a stratum of sandstone. So it's really just boulders, and under the boulders is solid rock. And the British failed to realize that it couldn't be entrenched by anyone, neither the Boers nor themselves. And of course, without an entrenchment, you are then on the surface, and you are then vulnerable to rifle fire and artillery fire. And the thing which had saved the Boers from being dislodged was the depth and complexity of their trenches. I think that was the lesson which was learned as time went by. But of course, this was a first for the British, the first time to fight an enemy as sophisticated as the Boers using armaments that they had, the first time to fight at these long ranges and to fight against an entrenched enemy they couldn't see the flashes of their rifles, couldn't see any smoke from their rifles, couldn't see the Boers at all. They were firing in the general direction they hoped they would be at. But Spioenkop was undefended, so the British thought, well, the weakness of a trench line is it only faces in one direction, and the Boer trench line just faced south towards the British lines. And a trench, of course, can't maneuver or pivot. So if you could get round to the side of a trench, you could then attack it down the trench, and it would then become pretty weak. Now, the thing about Spioenkop, as well as being high, it also has a long northern extension, which we call today Conical Hill. At the time of the battle, it didn't have a name, just called the northern extension of Spioenkop. And if you get onto Conical Hill, you look down from a few hundred feet, you look down onto the trenches of Green Hill on your left. So if the British could get onto Conical Hill, they could have converging fire onto Green Hill from the east, from Spioenkop, from the south, from Three Tree Hill, and from Picket Hill, which is a little hill just east of Three Tree Hill. And the Green Hill was clearly the weak point in the Boer line. It was stuck out on a thumb from the Boer trench line. It could be isolated. It could be brought under converging rifle fire, and it could be brought under converging artillery fire, because the British had batteries on Three Tree Hill, and they moved the 19th battery down to fire up the valley onto Green Hill as well. The problem was, in order to start this whole procedure, you'd have to do a flank attack onto Spioenkop, take Spioenkop, protect it against counterattack, and then start your main attack on Green Hill. The problem is that the British never managed to secure Spioenkop from the counterattack. When the inevitable counterattack came, it was highly successful and pinned the British down, so they were never able to get forward onto Conical Hill to start the main attack. So to talk you through what happened on Spioenkop, it starts the night before. On the night of the 23rd, 1,700 men assemble in a sort of dip in the ground on Tabanyama, just as night has fallen, so they can't be seen. It's about 1,700 men. It's just under 2 battalions. The Lancashire Fusiliers are the main British force, with the South Lancashire's Royal Lancasters backing them up, and a colonial force called Thornycroft's Mounted Infantry, 500 odd men of Thornycroft. So that makes up the attacking force. And they do a brilliant, completely silent nighttime assault of Spioenkop. They're not detected. And by 4 a.m., they're on the top. They'd scared away a picket of German and Freiheit burghers who were up there. And they, without any losses, really, I think a couple of wounded, they are now in possession of the summit of Spioenkop. And at 4 a.m., it's about half an hour before the first light. At 4 a.m., they let out a big cheer, and the British artillery starts to fire in the dark at prearranged targets to prevent the Boers from counterattacking. But all of this artillery firing in the night is very unusual, so it woke the Boers up, who began to immediately organize counterattack. And the counterattack fell on the Carolina Commando. They were the ones who were camped closest. They were under General Schalkberger, although he wasn't particularly popular general. And most people looked to Louis Botha, despite the fact that Schalkberger was actually nominally in charge of that sector. So in the early hours of daylight, the Boer counterattack starts. And the other thing to say is that if you go to Spioenkop in the summer, this was the height of summer, about once or twice a week, you'll find that the summit is completely shrouded in mist for the first few hours of the morning. This is a regular thing, probably a function of its height. And that's what happened on this morning, the morning of the 24th, is that there was dense mist on the summit. So while the British were trying to find their bearings on the summit and work out where they're going to put their entrenchment, the Boers had already begun to settle down on the periphery of the Spioenkop summit and start to fire into the mist where they could hear sounds. Everyone knows that the British trench on Spioenkop was inadequate. It was very shallow. It wasn't deep. I think 18 inches is what they would say. They managed to scrape away. And it was in a poor location. If you're on a plateau like Spioenkop, the worst place to try to defend is the center of the plateau. You could either go for the front 3 sides or the back side of a chessboard, if you imagine a square chessboard. They elected to dig their trench in the center, where they could be then fired at from all the fringes of the summit. So that was a poor choice. Having said which, I visited the summit of Spioenkop on many, many, many occasions, and I can't find a spot where one can dig a trench of any use. It's basically not diggable. So I think that's the problem of the geology rather than anything else. So by about 8:30 a.m., the mist is starting to lift and lifted quite suddenly. And almost immediately, General Woodgate was mortally wounded with a wound to his head. So the command on the summit becomes chaotic. Everyone's under fire from the Boers. There may not be many Boer riflemen on there, but the British thought they were under fire from thousands of men, just given the intensity and frequency of the firing. The other main thing that happens early on is that the heliograph signal station is destroyed by a Boer shell almost as soon as the mist lifts. So communication thereafter are very difficult. They have to signal with flags to General Buller, who's got a telegraph line to General Warren. General Buller and his team begin to interfere with proceedings as well as forwarding messages from that point on. But the story of Spioenkop has been very well rehearsed and worked out by many authors. So I'm just going to sort of skip forward to what I think are some highlights. The British attempted to take the peripheral positions on the plateau when they realized they were occupied by Boers or could be occupied by Boers, but they were forced back, and by sort of 10 or 11 in the morning, they were back to their original positions in the trench, except on the northwest of the plateau where they could hold out. They could remain there because the Boers couldn't encircle them to the west. There's a steep cliff to the west of the plateau, and the Boers couldn't work their way around there. So the British had some degree of safety on the northwest of the plateau, which they held. But in the east of the plateau, they were down to their original shallow trench. There was a large-scale surrender around midday from the Lancashire Fusiliers, which was really rescued by Thornycroft and the Middlesex during a bayonet charge to retake the trench. 2 other attempts to surrender happened on the plateau, but by about 2 p.m., the plateau itself was completely static. The Boers were concealed all the way around behind their rocks, and the British were pinned down, unable to move, unable to get water, just hoping that they wouldn't get hit if they lay still and lay as flat as possible. From about 2 p.m., most of the action happens actually on the southern part of Spioenkop Crest. There's a huge number of boulders. No entrenchment took place there at all. But the Boers tried to work their way around from Elenol, tried to work their way around the southern part of the summit to encircle the summit. And they were successfully driven off by a series of very brave bayonet charges. The other thing that happened from about 11 a.m. onwards were a series of reinforcements arrived. First up were the Middlesex Regiment and the Imperial Light Infantry, then the Scottish Rifles. Those 3 battalions went onto the summit, and then around 4 p.m., the King's Royal Rifles began to ascend Twin Peaks to the east. And then further reinforcements, the Connaught Rangers, the Tinsmount Infantry, and the Dorsets were also sent to the foot of Spioenkop. So this impulse to send battalion after battalion as reinforcement meant there was nowhere for these men to go. They were all kept in, apart from the 3 battalions I've mentioned who got onto the summit. That's the Imperial Light Infantry and the Middlesex and the Scottish Rifles, and the battalion of the King's Royal Rifles on Twin Peaks. There were also three battalions waiting in readiness at the foot of Spioenkop, which meant that the armies on both sides were so depleted they couldn't do any further action. The flank attack on Spioenkop had started small, but it had kind of sucked in all the reserve reinforcements that the British could provide as a sort of natural but incorrect response to a tragic situation, which they could all see unfolding from all over the battlefield. They could look through binoculars and could see the fighting on Spioenkop, could see their men falling, could see the attempts at trying to clear the Boers, could see the men coming under artillery fire, and so on. Now I'll stop there and see what you would like to know next.
No, I thank you so much for that, Rob. It really was a tragic battle, and I think you say it really well, and you explain it really well in your book, the various aspects of it. I think from there, I mean, before we go on, I know you mentioned trench warfare, and I know we'll have a couple of keen listeners. Maybe that's a different episode altogether, Max. But so we do acknowledge your point, and for those that's going to pick us up on it, we do know that there were trenches, Crimea's American Civil War, 1850s, 1860s, etc. But Rob's point is more the way that it took place in the South African terrain under those specific conditions, and that little bit of nuance over there. But I mean, for me, the last question is just what happened from there. So we have this epic battle that ends, and lots of narratives around it from both sides, Boer and British, and any significant consequences after that battle. Just in a line or two, Rob.
Yes, sure. Well, when Thornycroft made his way down from the mountain at about 1 a.m., he reached Warren's tent. Winston Churchill was with him. They woke Warren from sleeping. He really said, "What are the instructions?" They'd been such poor communication, they felt they had to speak to him directly. Thornycroft had already withdrawn the men from the summit, but there were thousands of men on the lower slopes ready to reoccupy it if that's what General Warren had said. It was still pitch dark. They could have reoccupied with relatively few losses. But I think Warren realized this hadn't worked out, and he didn't wish to prolong it either. And he immediately signaled General Buller to say, "We're going to have to withdraw." So on the 25th and 26th of January, we spent withdrawing back across the Tugela River. And by the morning of the 27th, the withdrawal had been complete. And the withdrawal was spectacularly bloodless, partly because the Boers were exhausted and had no stomach for following up on a retreating British army, but partly because the day of the 26th, it rained continually all day, and there was no visibility at all down to Trichardsrift from the Boer position. So that long plateau, which they'd had clear field of fire over, that field of fire had disappeared in the rain, and artillery had no targets to shoot at. So it was a very, very successful and bloodless withdrawal. And then a period of recuperation. Remember, neither side had slept under canvas since the 16th of January. So it was 11 days they'd been sleeping under the stars. It normally rained in the night. Both sides were absolutely exhausted from their kind of living conditions and the lack of food, the lack of shelter. And the British, for example, they hadn't had a chance to wash themselves or their clothing for 10 days. So they were really quite exhausted. And the next few days were spent licking their wounds and getting back to some sense of rest and strength. On the 6th of February, the British tried another major attack at Valkrans, just a few miles east of Spioenkop, and that failed. And then the final battle to break through at Ladysmith was conducted from the 17th to the 27th of February. And it was a 10-day battle. And I think the lessons have been learned there. I think the tactic became known as bite and hold. So in other words, if you got into a situation with the enemy where you couldn't break through, you didn't withdraw, you just went further up the line and kept extending the line day after day westwards. So in the end, the Boer line was so stretched that it gave way at one point, and then, like all defensive lines, once it's gone at one point, it then has to collapse. So the British Army learned very quickly the lessons of the Spioenkop campaign, the lessons of the Valkrans. There was no repetition of this kind of mistake or warfare during the Boer War, and I think I think the British Army were very quick to learn from Spioenkop. I think the importance of Spioenkop is that it's because there's so much visual material in these photographs that it's kind of seared into the consciousness of the British public. You've got all these football stadiums which have got a raised stand called the Kop, Spioenkop. That's really done out of sympathy for the men that they knew had died. I mean, there were only 320 odd men killed on Spioenkop. It's a very small number compared to what happened in the Great War or elsewhere. But to me, it's a little bit like in the same way that Rorke's Drift was kind of put on the map by the film Zulu. I think Spioenkop was put on the map 100 years earlier by these photographs taken by the Boer photographer Jan van Huppen. And then this widespread publication of these photographs gave the battle a kind of a recognition which it's never lost. And I think that's my take on it. That it was kind of it's kind of a tragedy which the public identified with very strongly, really out of keeping with the scale of the actual size of the battle and the size of the losses.
Rob, I think you've said it really well. I think that's an excellent place to end it today. All that you've mentioned just there about the photographs, it comes through really strongly in your book. And for our listeners, I've recently reviewed Rob's excellent book. That book the book review will go up on the War Diaries, also the History Avenue. And we will add some links into Rob's work in the show notes, as well as some of the maps. The whole discussion today was a bit of military geography as well as military history. So it will really complement this talk. And in the book, those photos that Rob mentions, it comes through strongly. 82 photos throughout, and it really accompanies that discussion, and it brings it home. He gives the background to it also, how Kodak cameras were used at the time, and that's why. So really an old school way of doing the modern Instagram So the eyeball, it goes straight from the battlefield, maybe a bit faster today, to the living room. And then the Crimean War, it happened a bit faster too, with war correspondence. But this was how it was captured, in during the Anglo-Boer War. And it really does paint a narrative that's striking, and it still lives on. From us, a very big thank you, Rob. It was a real pleasure to have you today and to get this masterclass. And then, Max, last words to you as always.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Rob. And I concur with Tony. It was a real and true masterclass, and I've learned a lot today. And I'm also excited to read the book because I haven't read it yet. But we will also post the links, as Tony said, in the show notes so you can get it yourselves. So big thanks to you, Rob. And for everybody else, thank you for listening. And we will be back next week. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.